To understand the monster, you must first meet the child. And the child the Roman Empire first met was not a monster. He was a mascot, a darling. His name wasn't even Caligula. That was a nickname, an affectionate diminutive bestowed upon him by the hardened legionaries who served under his heroic father Germanicus. It meant little boots, after the miniature military sandals he wore as he toddled through the army camps, a living symbol of dynastic hope and military pride. He was the son of Rome's most beloved general and the great-grandson of the divine Augustus himself. The empire didn't just see a future in him, they saw a fairy tale. They looked at this boy, this Caligula, and they fell in love. So, the question that echoes through 2 millennia of history is not just a question of evil, but of transformation. How did little Boots grow up to stomp the Roman world under his heel? What curdled the love of an entire empire into a collective, shivering terror? What happened to that little boy that allowed, or rather, forced the monster within to claw its way out? This is not merely a list of atrocities. That would be too simple. This is a psychological autopsy performed 2,000 years too late. We will not just look at what he did, but dive into the abyss of why. We will trace the hairline fractures in his soul, the deep, septic wounds of his childhood that festered into the madness that would one day hold the known world hostage. This journey will change how you see the nature of evil. It is not born. It is meticulously, brutally crafted. The first fracture, the origin point of the seismic devastation to come, appeared in the one place that should have been his sanctuary, his family. Caligula was born into the Roman equivalent of royalty, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, but this was a family that devoured its own. The reigning emperor, Tiberius, was a man steeped in paranoia, a gloomy and suspicious tyrant who saw shadows and assassins in every corner of his palace. And the brightest light in the empire, Caligula's father Germanicus, cast the longest shadow of all. Germanicus was everything Tiberius was not. Popular, charismatic, a brilliant military commander beloved by the people and the legions. In the twisted logic of a paranoid autocrat, this did not make Germanicus an asset. It made him a threat. In 19 AD, while on a tour of the eastern provinces, Germanicus fell suddenly and violently ill. As he lay dying, he was convinced he had been poisoned, and he whispered his suspicions to his wife, Agrippina the Elder. He made her swear to protect their children and avenge his death. With his last breath, the golden age of Caligula's childhood ended. He was just 7 years old. The psychological impact of losing a father at such a tender age is devastating enough. But for Caligula, it was compounded by a terrifying new reality. His father hadn't just died, he had been murdered. And the murderer, everyone suspected, sat on the imperial throne. This wasn't a death, it was an execution, and it was just the beginning. Agrippina, true to her husband's dying wish, became a figure of defiant opposition to Tiberius. She carried her husband's ashes back to Rome in a grand, public display of mourning that was an implicit accusation. She was proud, fierce, and utterly politically naive. She thought the love of the people could protect her. She was wrong. Tiberius, influenced by the venomous whispers of his praetorian prefect Sejanus, began to see the entire family of Germanicus not as relatives, but as a rival faction, a cancer to be cut out. The purge was systematic, it was cold, it was total. Caligula's older brother, Nero Caesar, was the first to fall. He was declared a public enemy, arrested, and exiled to the island of Ponza, where he was starved to death in 31 AD. Ancient historians tell a gruesome story that, before he died, he was shown the tattered rags of his other starving brother Drusus to mock his own impending fate. Drusus Caesar was next, imprisoned in the dungeons of the Palatine Hill in Rome. He was kept alive just long enough to be driven mad by hunger, reportedly resorting to chewing the stuffing from his own mattress before he finally perished. His mother, the fiery Agrippina, was exiled to a different island prison, Panditeria. When she protested her treatment, a centurion beat her so savagely that he flogged one of her eyes out of its socket. She, too, was starved to death, refusing to eat until she wasted away. Imagine being Caligula, a young teenager watching this unfold. Your heroic father gone, your proud mother blinded and starved, your older brothers, your protectors and rivals, systematically erased from existence. He was one of the very few who survived, along with his 3 sisters. But survival in such a context is its own kind of prison. He was spared not out of mercy, but likely because his youth made him seem like a non-threat. This breeds a unique and toxic psychological condition. Survivor's guilt mixed with paralyzing fear. Why me? Why was I spared? Am I next? Every friendly face could be a spy. Every meal could be poisoned. Every quiet moment was filled with the screams he couldn't unhear. This is the soil in which paranoia takes root. The true masterclass in cruelty, however, was yet to come. In 31 A.D., after the downfall of Sejanus, Tiberius summoned the teenage Caligula to his infamous island retreat, Capri. If Caligula's childhood had been a lesson in loss, Capri was his postgraduate education in terror. The island was not a palace. It was a fortress of paranoia, a laboratory of debauchery and psychological torture. Here, the aging Tiberius, now a complete recluse, ruled the empire from afar, indulging his darkest impulses. The historians Suetonius and Tacitus paint a picture of a place where systematic cruelty was a form of entertainment, a place of spies, secret trials, and summary executions where victims were hurled from the cliffs into the sea below. For 6 years, Caligula lived in this gilded cage with the man who had destroyed his family. He wasn't a guest, he was a hostage, a political prisoner under constant, terrifying scrutiny. He had to live every single moment of his life as a performance. He had to show absolute devotion to the emperor he knew had murdered his kin. He had to laugh at Tiberius's cruel jokes. He had to participate in, or at least silently witness, the depravities that defined the island court. The slightest misstep, a flicker of resentment in his eyes, a single word of dissent would have meant his immediate death. This was the ultimate psychological crucible. It burned away any innocence he had left and forged a mask of perfect compliance. He became, as one historian noted, the greatest actor in all of Rome. It was on Capri that Caligula learned the fundamental lessons that would define his reign. He learned that power was not about justice or administration. It was about the absolute, untrammeled ability to inflict your will upon others. He learned from Tiberius that cruelty could be a precise instrument, a tool for testing loyalty and exposing weakness. Most importantly, he learned that to survive, one must become what the predator wants to see. He had to be a mirror, reflecting back Tiberius's own suspicions and desires. Inside, a storm of terror, grief, and rage was brewing. But on the outside, there was only a placid, smiling surface. This duality, this chasm between the inner self and the outer performance, is a classic pathway to severe psychological fracture. One famous quote, attributed to him by Suetonius, perfectly encapsulates the philosophy he forged in that island prison. Let them hate me so long as they fear me. This is often seen as the motto of a born tyrant, but in the context of his upbringing, it reads differently. It's the mantra of a survivor. It's the desperate conclusion of a boy who has learned that love is fickle and loyalty is a lie. Love couldn't save his father. Love couldn't save his mother or his brothers. But fear was a currency that even an emperor respected. Fear was a shield. Fear was power. On Capri, surrounded by the ghosts of his family and the very real monster who had created them, Caligula's worldview was irrevocably shattered and then reassembled into a new, terrifying shape. The first great crack in his soul was now a gaping fissure, waiting for the pressure of absolute power to split it wide open. He had survived Tiberius's Academy of Terror, but the price of his graduation was his own humanity. When Tiberius finally died in 37 A.D., the Roman world did not mourn. It erupted in celebration. The gloomy tyrant was gone, and in his place stood his chosen heir, the last surviving son of the beloved Germanicus. Caligula's ascension was not just a political succession, it was a national catharsis. The people saw him not as the student of Tiberius, but as the ghost of his father returned. They poured into the streets, hailing him as our star, our chick, our baby. The Senate, eager to curry favor with the new ruler and erase the memory of their servitude to Tiberius, immediately granted him supreme power. For the first time in his life, Caligula was not just safe, he was universally adored, and for a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though the fairy tale might, against all odds, come true. The first 7 months of Caligula's reign were a golden age. He seemed determined to be the antithesis of the man who had haunted his youth. He freed citizens who had been unjustly imprisoned by Tiberius. He burned the records of the treason trials that had been the hallmark of the previous reign. He banished the sexual deviants, the spintriae, who had catered to Tiberius's perversions on Capri. He was generous with the public, hosting lavish games and spectacles, and he showed great respect to the Senate, promising an era of cooperation. He was handsome, charismatic, and articulate. Rome breathed a collective sigh of relief. The trauma of his childhood, it seemed, had not broken him. Perhaps it had even tempered him, made him compassionate. They believed they had found their golden emperor. But the human mind is a fragile thing. A soul forged in the crucible of trauma does not simply heal with a change of scenery. The mask of the perfect ruler that Caligula wore was just that. A mask, expertly crafted but held in place by a will that was already deeply fractured. And in October of 37 A.D., just a few months into his reign, that will was shattered by a force he could not control. Caligula fell gravely ill. The exact nature of the illness remains a subject of intense historical and medical debate. The ancient sources are vague, describing it only as a brain fever. Modern theories range from encephalitis or meningitis, which can cause severe swelling of the brain, to temporal lobe epilepsy, which can trigger profound personality changes and psychotic episodes. Some have suggested a complete nervous breakdown, a catastrophic collapse of his psychological defenses under the immense pressure of his new role. Whatever the cause, the effect was absolute. Caligula lay on the brink of death for weeks. The empire held its breath. The citizens who had so recently celebrated his arrival now gathered in the streets, keeping vigils, offering their own lives to the gods in exchange for his. When he finally recovered, the man who rose from the sickbed was not the same one who had entered it. The adoring prayers of the empire had been answered, but the being they got back was something else entirely. The Golden Emperor was gone, and in his place stood a tyrant more unpredictable and more terrifying than Tiberius had ever been. The illness, whatever it was, appears to have acted as a final, catastrophic blow to an already damaged psyche. It seems to have severed the last remaining threads that tethered him to reason, unleashing the paranoid, rage-filled child who had been hiding inside him all along. The first and most immediate symptom of this transformation was a volcanic eruption of paranoia. The fear of betrayal that had been his constant companion on Capri now became his governing philosophy. He saw assassins everywhere. He began to believe that the members of his court, especially those who had been closest to him, secretly wished him dead. He became convinced that their public displays of devotion during his illness were a sham, a cover for their true, treacherous intentions. One of the first victims of this new reality was Tiberius Gemellus, his co-heir and grandson of the former emperor. Caligula forced him to commit suicide, accusing him of feigning a cough to avoid drinking a poison antidote, thus implying Gemellus was part of a plot against him. His father-in-law, Marcus Junius Silanus, was next, also forced to kill himself on the flimsiest of pretexts. He even turned on his loyal Praetorian prefect Macro, the very man who had secured his ascension to the throne. Caligula thanked him for his service by forcing him and his wife to commit suicide. This wasn't just political maneuvering. It was the desperate, lashing out of a mind that could no longer distinguish between friend and foe. The boy who had watched his family be destroyed one by one was now a man with absolute power, determined to strike first, to eliminate any and all perceived threats before they could eliminate him. The terror he had been forced to internalize for years was now being externalized, projected onto everyone around him. The second profound change was the crystallization of a terrifying God complex. Before his illness, Caligula was a ruler. After, he began to see himself as a living deity. This was more than just the standard Roman practice of deifying past emperors. Caligula demanded to be worshipped as a god while he was still alive. He declared himself the living embodiment of Jupiter, the king of the gods. This was not just arrogance, it was a desperate psychological defense mechanism. In a world where everyone is a potential traitor, the only safe position is one of supreme, untouchable power. If he was a god, he was no longer mortal. If he was a god, no one could harm him. If he was a god, the rules of human morality no longer applied to him. He began to build temples to himself. He replaced the heads of famous statues of gods with likenesses of his own. He would appear in public dressed as various deities, sometimes as Hercules, sometimes as Venus, sometimes as Apollo. He even built a bridge connecting his palace on the Palatine Hill directly to the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline, so that he could, as he claimed, consult with his fellow god in private. He blurred the line between the sacred and the profane, between ruler and ruled, until the only reality he seemed to accept was the one constructed by his own delusions. He demanded that senators and nobles prostrate themselves before him and kiss his feet, an act of submission utterly humiliating to the Roman elite. This wasn't just about respect, it was about degradation. It was about forcing the powerful to feel the same powerlessness that he had felt for so many years on Capri. His infamous plan to make his horse, Incitatus, a consul, is often cited as the ultimate proof of his madness. And while it likely was a sign of a deranged mind, it was also a calculated act of political theater. It was his way of saying to the Roman Senate, "You are all so useless, so corrupt, that my horse is more fit to rule than any of you." It was the ultimate expression of his contempt for a system he felt had betrayed his family and forced him to live a life of fear. The fever had broken the chains of reason. The mask of the benevolent prince had melted away in the heat of his illness, revealing the scarred and twisted face of the survivor beneath. The paranoia of his youth, now amplified by absolute power and possibly by physical brain damage, had become a raging inferno. His newfound divinity was the only logical endpoint for a man who had been taught from childhood that humanity was a web of lies, deceit, and murder. He had escaped the cage of Tiberius only to build a new one around himself, a cage of divine madness, from which he would now rule and terrorize the Roman world. The stage was set for a reign where the emperor's personal nightmares would become the public's horrific reality. With the emperor now a self-proclaimed god and his paranoia a raging, unquenchable fire, the Roman world transformed into his personal theater. It was a stage upon which he could reenact and project his deepest traumas and most twisted desires, all while forcing the Roman elite to be both his audience and his unwilling cast. And it was in the realm of the erotic, the deeply personal and private, that his madness found its most grotesque and terrifying expression. To analyze Caligula's horrific sexual practices merely as acts of lust is to miss the point entirely. They were not about pleasure. They were about power, humiliation, and the complete annihilation of the social and moral order that he felt had failed him. They were the instruments of his psychological revenge. The most infamous of his alleged practices was incest with his three sisters, Agrippina the Younger, Julia Livilla, and, most obsessively, Drusilla. The Roman historians Suetonius and Cassius Dio, both writing decades after his death and with a clear bias against him, report that he treated his sisters as his wives, engaging in sexual relations with them at public banquets, to the horror of the guests. While we must approach these accounts with caution, acknowledging that accusations of incest were a common political smear tactic in Rome, the sheer consistency of the report suggests they reflect a reality, or at least a perceived reality, that deeply shocked the Roman aristocracy. From a psychological perspective, this was not simple perversion. It was a profoundly symbolic act. His family had been systematically destroyed, ripped apart by political intrigue. In his broken mind, by engaging in incest, he was attempting to reconstruct a family unit in the most absolute and exclusive way possible. He was creating a new, divine family, separate from and superior to the treacherous world of mortal alliances. His obsession with Drusilla was particularly telling. He treated her as his divine consort, his Juno to his Jupiter. When she died suddenly in 38 A.D., he was consumed by a grief so profound that he made it a capital crime for anyone in the empire to laugh, bathe, or dine with their family. He then had her deified, making her the first woman in Roman history to be declared a goddess. This was the desperate act of a man trying to make his beloved sister immortal, to save her from the fate that had befallen the rest of his family. He wasn't just sleeping with his sisters. He was trying to elevate them and himself beyond the reach of death and betrayal. But if his relationship with his sisters was a twisted attempt to rebuild something sacred, his treatment of the wives and daughters of the Roman elite was a calculated campaign to desecrate it. Caligula established what can only be described as an imperial brothel within his own palace. He then forced the wives and daughters of prominent senators and nobles to work in it, sending out official invitations to men of all classes to come and enjoy their services. The historical sources are clear that this was not a desperate measure to raise funds, despite Caligula's extravagant spending. It was an act of supreme, targeted humiliation. Think of the psychological mechanism at play. The Roman senatorial class prided itself on its dignity, its lineage, and the honor of its family. A man's wife and daughters were the embodiment of his public standing and private virtue. By forcibly turning these women into prostitutes, Caligula was not just assaulting them. He was symbolically castrating their husbands and fathers. He was demonstrating, in the most visceral way imaginable, that every aspect of their lives, their property, their honor, their families, was subject to his absolute will. He was telling them, "Your laws do not apply to me. Your traditions mean nothing. Your bodies are my playthings." It was a message he had learned on Capri, now delivered on an imperial scale. He was forcing the most powerful men in Rome to feel the same sense of violation and powerlessness that he had endured as a boy. His personal conduct at banquets was a further refinement of this theater of cruelty. He was known to interrupt a dinner party, have a high-ranking guest's wife brought to his private chambers, and then return to the table to publicly critique or praise her performance in bed, all while her husband was forced to sit and listen in humiliated silence. He would whimsically marry women, sometimes taking them from their own wedding feasts, only to discard them days later. This was not the behavior of a man seeking love or companionship. It was the impulsive, destructive behavior of a deeply damaged individual with no concept of boundaries, for whom other human beings had ceased to be people and had become objects, disposable props in the drama of his own ego. This fusion of sexual depravity and violent power reached its apex in his treatment of his fourth and final wife, Millennia Caesonia. The historians report that he loved her deeply, yet his expression of that love was pathologically twisted. He would reportedly threaten to have her tortured to find out why he was so devoted to her. He would parade her naked before his friends and guards. He had a singular obsession: to see people suffer, to push them to their absolute limits, as if to test whether their pain was as real as his own. He famously lamented that his reign had not been marked by a great public disaster, like a military defeat or a plague. This is the cry of a mind so consumed by its own trauma that it can only relate to the world through the lens of catastrophe. He found a perverse comfort in chaos, because a world in pain was a world that finally understood him. The erotic for Caligula was never about intimacy. It was about violation. It was the language he used to communicate his own internal agony, a spectacle of cruelty designed to make the world as ugly and broken as he felt inside. The end, when it came, was inevitable. His reign of terror, a mere 4 years long, had united every faction in Rome against him. The Senate he had humiliated, the families he had destroyed, and, crucially, the Praetorian Guard he had both relied on and mocked, all conspired to bring him down. In January of 41 A.D., as he was leaving a theater, a group of Praetorian officers, led by a man named Cassius Chaerea, whom Caligula had constantly taunted for his high-pitched voice, ambushed him. They stabbed him 30 times. The boy, who had been called Little Boots, died in a bloody heap in a palace corridor. His wife, Caesonia, was murdered moments later, and their infant daughter, Julia Drusilla, had her head smashed against a wall. The cycle of familial destruction that had begun with his father, Germanicus, had now consumed Caligula and his own line completely. The performance was over. Caligula was not a demon born of hellfire. He was the final, tragic product of a poisoned inheritance. He was a case study in what happens when profound childhood trauma is left to fester and is then combined with the corrosive acid of absolute, unchecked power. His horrific practices were not the calculated acts of a sane tyrant. They were the chaotic, desperate screams of a broken mind, amplified for the entire world to hear. History remembers him as a monster, and his actions were undeniably monstrous. But perhaps the more chilling lesson is not that monsters exist, but that they are made. He is the terrifying proof that the most depraved acts of cruelty are often rooted in the deepest wells of human suffering. The question Caligula leaves us with is not, how could a man be so evil, but rather, how far is any of us from madness when the soul is stripped of everything it loves,